Palos Verdes, a secluded, luxurious place away from the roar of busy downtown Los Angeles. The Los Angeles Harbor, one of the last beachfront properties to be upgraded along the California coastline. Both communities are peaceful, quiet, and growing neighborhoods. However, it was not always like this.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Coastal defense was in a state of emergency after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Fortunately, by June of 1941, Fort MacArthur was in a state of readiness. The gun batteries were activated to full strength, and the fort was put on dawn and dusk alert, tracking all shipping in the Catalina Channel. Marty Boone, a gun commander at Fort MacArthur, heard the news of Pearl Harbor while on a fishing leave and immediately returned to his base.
I got here about 8 o'clock that evening of December the 7th. There was no panic. The old American spirit came to the fore, and none of us were frightened. None of us were anxious. We all had jobs to do. All of my brother officers and our enlisted men were all angry. They were angry to think that someone would attack our ships at Pearl Harbor and we would suffer such a defeat. This had never happened in our history before, and everybody wanted to get even.
Coastal defense felt undergunned. The whole seacoast was open to attack. On the morning of December 24th, 1941, their fear materialized. An American lumber freighter, the Absaroka, was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine, the I-19, within 2 miles of Point Fermin, San Pedro.
We were on dawn alert, and we were tracking ships in the channel, and southbound, here was a lumber schooner, and we were interested in that because we both had our battery commander's scope on them, and we were commenting on the fact that we could see the skipper in the pilot house, and there was a couple of guys on a stack of lumber in the back. All of a sudden, lumber was flying to the left and right, and the ship skewed around and seemed like it was heading ashore.
With the destroyers and aircraft chasing it, the Japanese submarine got away. The Absaroka did not sink and had 1 casualty. By now, coastal defense feared an invasion all along the coast with the anticipation of a possible loss of the Los Angeles harbor. They believed that the Japanese would come in with heavy ships and, at will, shell several aircraft plants and oil refineries. Also, if an enemy invasion did occur, they would have to have a deep-water port in order to unload supplies and reinforcements. In anticipation of having to defend against a possible attack by the Japanese, there was an urgency to fortify and protect the coast. In the early dark days of the war, in anticipation of a Japanese invasion, the Army was ordered to prepare to make a last-ditch stand to keep Fort MacArthur's big guns from falling into enemy hands, for they could have been turned and fired on Los Angeles. Seen here are the remnants of a trench which led to several machine gun positions that were set up on the edge of the gun's parapets. Sometime in the late 1920s, a mount was developed in Panama called the Panama Mount. When every day seemed to count in the beginning of the war, the Panama Mount was able to take a 155mm field artillery weapon and mount it in a matter of days for coast artillery use. Coastal defense put up a series of 16 different mounts along the coast. These guns had a range of about 12 miles. If the Japanese attacked the Los Angeles harbor, it would have been carried out, most likely, by fast-moving torpedo boats. To prevent this, there was a building program to install over 20 90mm rapid-fire anti-motor torpedo boat guns. 50 6-inch batteries were constructed on both coasts of the United States. Of the 25 batteries located on the west coast from Alaska to San Diego, there were installed locally Battery 242 in Bolsa Chica, Battery 241 in Fort MacArthur, and Battery 240 in Palos Verdes. Instead of spending the much-needed time to build a heavy, steel-reinforced concrete battery, Coastal Defense ordered special turreted guns, which were made out of 8-inch thick molded steel.
This is the base ring on which the 6-inch gun and battery 240 sat. Each Coast Artillery battery had 2 guns. A second ring identical to this is about 50 yards in that direction behind me. There are several features unique to each of these gun pits. Behind me is an ammunition storage cove where ammunition was stored in great number in case it was needed. Over here behind this concrete wall is a telephone switchboard where the plotting room from inside the battery would communicate to the gun pit crew as to where the target was. These guns could fire an intermediate range of 15 miles. The shell itself weighed about 100 pounds. The powder bag, which was loaded separately, weighed about 50 pounds. In a separate room, there were 3 giant Worthington generators that would supply backup power in case the power to the battery was severed by a bomb or a shell.
14-inch railway guns. The United States had only 4 of these in its entire arsenal. Each gun weighed on their flatbed railway car 365 tons. The flat cars were 14-axled, and the guns could fire a 1,560-pound projectile 25 miles. 2 of the guns went to Panama and stayed there until the end of the war. The other 2 guns became Battery Irwin on the lower reservation of Fort MacArthur. The gun's concussion, when target shooting, created some panic and broke windows throughout San Pedro. On one particular occasion, they even collapsed a building. Because of this, the Army was not allowed to fire these guns at Fort MacArthur. To target practice, the guns had to be towed to 2 sites that were not so heavily populated. The first site was Dawn, located at the present-day Camp Pendleton. The second site was Naples, which was 15 miles north of Santa Barbara. Battery Bunker was named after Colonel Paul D. Bunker, one of the harbor defense commanders of Corregidor. He was captured by the Japanese and later died in captivity. Construction of the guns began in 1942 and was completed by 1944. Over the top of the entire battery is 16.5 feet of steel-reinforced concrete.
The type of guns that were here were the largest seacoast guns in the United States. They were 16-inch guns. They had a range of about 26 to 27 miles. This particular gun here could fire over the Isthmus of Catalina. It also could reach Avalon. About 100 yards to my right, the other gun actually could fire, if necessary, as far as the intersection of Sunset Boulevard and Pacific Coast Highway in Santa Monica.
The shells weighed between 2,300 to 2,700 pounds. It would be like firing a Volkswagen at the target. To fire the shell, 800 pounds of powder were used, which were in bags known as cartridge cloth. Just to accommodate the powder and shell, the breech of the gun alone was 15 feet in length. Before World War II, coastal defense was a concern of the War Department. In 1914, a small military post located in San Pedro was formally established and named after the Civil War hero Lieutenant General Arthur MacArthur, the father of Douglas MacArthur. Since aircraft were not conceived as a weapon at that time, the original purpose of the fort was to protect the harbor against a possible invasion. Before America was formally involved in World War I, the mortar batteries Barlow and Sexton were nearing completion. On December 16, 1916, the guns were installed. They were 12-inch, high-angle mortars that were designed to fire 800-pound projectiles onto the very thin decks of heavy warships. This was a forerunner to what bombs could do to battleships. The batteries were capable of firing 4 mortars at one time every 20 seconds continuously. Target information passed to each gun came from the plotting room and put on an information board. It took 2 sets of numbers to aim the guns accurately. The Army had to keep a very close count as to how many times these guns would fire, because the barrels would wear out after 300 rounds. In their 26 years of existence, one gun fired as few as 6 times, and another fired as many as 175 times. The disappearing carriage or rifle program initially began in 1890. In 1916, batteries Osgood Farley, Leary Miriam in Fort MacArthur were the last guns of this type to be installed in the United States. Let us now take an in-depth look on how coastal guns operated. The commander of the battery was located in a battery command station. As commander, this room had to have a communication net, called speaking tubes, that were connected to all the vital parts of the battery. The system was modified to a telephone network in World War II. The battery command station served also as an artillery observation station. Besides the battery command station, there were 24 other artillery observation stations, officially called base end stations, located from Palos Verdes to Bolsa Chica. Observation stations were small 1- or 2-man positions. In World War II, these stations were enlarged to accommodate 5 to 6 men. Target information was gathered by an instrument called a depression position finder. This instrument would determine the azimuth, or direction, and elevation, or distance, to the target. This data was relayed to the plotting room through the communication net. The plotting room had the most important function in the battery. The plotting room would provide and coordinate the guns with target information by setting up a triangulation from data received from at least 2 artillery observation stations reporting on the same target. Once a triangulation was established, the target could then be pinpointed. Let us take a look at a plotting room in action.
28510. 270.20.
Flash, flash.
3.10.
2.95 set.
Clear.
305.
2.95.
3.00 set.
Clear.
297.
Target information was then relayed from the plotting room via a network of cables through a 170-foot-long mechanical indicator tunnel that led to the gun pit. There, the target information was flashed on a target information board.
Since the numbers could not be seen by everyone in the gun pit, a soldier was stationed here next to this blackboard. When the azimuth numbers were flashed, he would write in chalk next to A that set of numbers. When the elevation numbers appeared, he would write under E the elevation sequence. That way, everybody in the gun pit could see the numbers, including the battery commander. Another question might come up as to when did the gun crew know when to fire the gun? Here's the answer. This is a cover over a bell. The gun was fired on what they call a time interval bell. The bell went off every 20 seconds. On the 4th bell, the gun fired. This announced from the plotting room the proper coordination of moving target with the arriving projectile.
Before the gun could be fired, powder and shells had to be brought out from the battery.
There are 4 corridors in this battery. 2 are powder magazines, and 2 are shell storage magazines. I'm standing in shell storage magazine number 1. Behind me on this table is an original 14-inch projectile of the type used by the 14-inch disappearing rifles. This shell weighed 1,560 pounds. The gun could fire it 14 miles. The shell is sitting on what is called a loading table.
The shells were stored in racks and were brought out with a block and tackle with a large clamp and rolled onto the loading table. A 2-man crew pushing a shot cart or a shell cart would pull up in front of the loading table, and the shell would be released onto the cart and taken to the gun pit. As many as 5 shells a minute could be brought out from this table.
I'm standing on a platform overlooking the gun pit. The type of gun that was installed here was a 14-inch, what was called a disappearing carriage or disappearing rifle. When these batteries were built in 1916, the airplane was not conceived as a weapon. Therefore, the only threat appeared to be from battleships or heavy ships firing at this position. All the protection is in the front of the gun. The parapet fronting the gun is 20 feet thick, steel reinforced concrete.
In the down position, the guns would be loaded and pre-sighted. A 60-ton counterweight which was suspended underneath the carriage was dropped into a counterweight room which would then propel the 60-ton barrel over the edge of the parapet into the firing position. Let us now listen to part of a declassified military training film showing rare footage of the 14-inch disappearing carriage in action.
Maximum efficiency must be maintained throughout the entire battery installation. The guns must be carefully laid. Otherwise, every other man's effort to obtain accuracy is wasted. In short, perfect teamwork, timing, coordination, and accuracy are required of a coast artillery firing battery. I'll be firing this gun in a few seconds. Let's pause a moment and watch it in action. There goes the shell. The time of flight at this range is about 30 seconds. Since this is only practice, the target is that tent-like object out there in tow of the tug. It's about 20,000 yards from the guns. Watch for the splash, and it's close.
None of the big guns were ever fired in anger. By 1945, all the coast artillery guns were considered obsolete and were dismantled, and the batteries were deactivated. There are remnants of the past that can still be seen today. In 1976, Battery Osgood and Battery Farley were officially placed on the National Register of Historic Places. In October of 1985, these historic batteries became the Fort MacArthur Military Museum. The museum is maintained by 8 to 10 highly skilled painters, carpenters, and electricians who have an interest in military history. These volunteers spend 6 to 8 hours every Saturday and Sunday working to restore the old batteries. At the museum, new discoveries are constantly being made.
In 1980, a bulldozer clearing off this slope overlooking Point Furman uncovered this old artillery observation station that had been built in 1916 and buried sometime in 1944. This particular station has some historic significance. A sergeant named Herschel Adams, a Coast Artillery observer, was observing and tracking the Absaroka and actually saw the wake of the torpedo that hit the Absaroka from the Japanese submarine.
In April 1990, a powder magazine that used to supply powder from a 155mm Panama mount was partially uncovered.
Although you could only see the top of it, it was approximately 10 feet in length. It was built in the shape of a Quonset hut. The steel itself was about a half-inch thick. It was about 10 feet wide, had a wooden floor, and had racks to store the powder on.
The coast again lies safe, quiet, and peaceful. The battlements are stilled and the guns are gone. With today's constant threat of war looming over man's horizon, are these warriors of the silent siege walking into our past, or are they a part of our future? Let these shadows be a constant reminder of the lessons taught from our fading and distant past.